exactly the feel-good movie of the year, but very powerful. Such a beautiful film. I'd like to welcome our panelists on stage. Here's Susan Swanberg, who's going to be moderating. She's going to come up from the UA School of Journalism, and she'll introduce our guests.
Good evening. Thank you very much for staying for this part of our event. We're going to have a really animated discussion, I think, concerning the movie and also some of the implications of the movie. We have some amazing people to participate in this panel. We have Jim Robbins, who's a science writer, science journalist. He's written stories for the New York Times. He has a number of books. His most recent book is about birds, which I'll ask him about later. I think Jim is a person who, even though he understands the realities and writes about them and explains them, he also likes to leave us with a little hope. So stick around for that hope. And then I would also like to introduce Dr. Valerie Trouet, who works for the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research, which we call affectionately the Tree Ring Lab. So come and join us, and we'll talk about the film together. So first I wanted to speak to Dr. Trouet, because the movie starts out with an incredible image of fire and flame. And what did that image say to you about, go ahead and open your bottle.
Drink a little sip of water first.
Those are recyclable bottles, by the way.
Ah.
Yes, you can refill them, they're aluminum.
Thank you.
Go ahead, if you could explain what the fire meant to you, and what has changed in the way we deal with fire, and what did tree rings tell us about that?
Yeah, so I'm a tree ring scientist. I study the climate of the past and how it has influenced humans and forests, and amongst other aspects of the forest, I also study fire history, so how fire used to influence our forests. What I've learned about fire is that it's not always a bad thing. So a lot of forests actually need fire, and I don't know if anyone has grabbed one of those, but so I used rings in trees to date when fires happened in the past. So we can, in the past, here in the Southwest and in California where I work, the fires didn't used to be the destructive kind of wildfires that we see nowadays.
And why was that?
Because they were frequent. Fires would occur every 5 to 10 years, and as a result, they wouldn't grow very big. They would damage the trees. That's why they leave scars that we can then date using tree rings. But they wouldn't kill the trees. They would kill the underburn. They would, the understory. They would burn off the fuels every 5 to 10 years, and as a result, by lack of fuel, the fires would not get very big and not destructive as they are now. What happened around 1900, and what we know from tree rings around 1900, once the Forest Service was established, we've become very, very effective in putting out fires. And so as a result, instead of having regular low intensity, so ground fires every 5 to 10 years, we've now had more than a century of no fire, basically. As someone who studies fire scars for a living and has spent months traipsing through the Sierra Nevada looking for these fire scars, I have not found a single fire scar in the 21st or the 20th century. All of our fire scars end by 1900. So we have been so effective at putting out fires that we've really changed not only the fire regime and the fuel conditions of the forest, but the state of the forest itself.
So you can actually read in the trees, in the tree rings, how we have intervened and imposed our will on the environment in a way that has left scars, or doesn't leave scars.
Or the lack of scars, exactly. Because nowadays, because of all the fuel that's been building up over more than a century, fires now are no longer those light intensity ground fires, but now the fires reach the canopy and they actually become destructive, and you get the big destructive wildfires. And that is a perfect storm of conditions that has led to the change in fire regime here in the Western US.
And we do have a wonderful illustration from a book that I'll ask you about that's forthcoming in the spring of 2020. We do have some copies of this with information on the back about her book if you're interested, but it's an incredible diagram that shows the regular fires during the 1800s and 1700s, and then the remarkable mark on the tree ring that you call the 20th century curl.
Yeah, we call it the curl. I don't know if you can see it as from where you're sitting, but you see the regular fires up until the 20th century, and then the complete lack of fires, which creates this century of growth that kind of curls around the scars. So it's something that we haven't seen prior to the 20th century, prior to the Anthropocene.
Yes, and we do have, if someone's interested in seeing this diagram, we do have some that we can pass out. So, one of the interesting comments in the trailer to the movie was that the Anthropocene, or Anthropocene, is the time in the geological record when humans have moved the planet outside its natural limits. So, looking from the perspective of trees, other than fire, are there other natural limits beyond which we've gone and we've pushed the
Yeah, there's
environment?
actually a really nice study that one of my colleagues in New Zealand published a couple of years ago, and they called it the loneliest tree on Earth. So it's a single tree that was planted in around 1900 on an island in the Southern Ocean, so around 600 kilometers south of New Zealand. So really, literally, just one tree that was planted there. Literally the loneliest tree on Earth. And what they found is they looked at the radiocarbon in that tree, and they found a peak in the radiocarbon in 1964, which is kind of the last year of the atomic bomb tests. And so they determined that if these isotopes, these radiocarbon molecules, are detected even in the loneliest tree of the Earth, of the planet, that's what we're going to say, that's the start of the Anthropocene. If even the most remote, the loneliest tree is affected by something that we humans did, that's where we put the start of the Anthropocene.
Now, we haven't officially adopted that name, correct? It's a name that scientists think is appropriate, but what is the process through which that would be adopted as the official name of this epoch?
That process is long and bureaucratic. So there's quite a lot of things that go into defining a geological epoch. That's what we want to do for what wants to be what the discussion is for the Anthropocene. But as I mentioned, that's, I think Nancy mentioned that it only just made it into the vocabulary in 2014, and so making that an official geological epoch is going to take a little longer than 5 years.
But we don't have to wait to use the term, do we?
We don't have to wait till no. Even us scientists do not have to wait to use it.
Now, briefly, tell us about the book that's coming out in the spring.
Yeah, wow, thank you for asking me about it. So I wrote I was on sabbatical 2 years ago, which gave me some time to write a book. It's a broad audience book, so intended exactly for this audience, about tree rings, and about what we know from tree rings about climate history and about human history and about wildfires and how they're all connected to each other. That's what the book is about. It's called Tree Story, and it'll come out in April 2020. We're trying to push for it to come out for the Tucson Festival of Books, but we'll see if we can make that happen.
Will you be speaking there?
I will likely be speaking at the TUSON Festival. Yes.
Great, thank you. So if you're interested in finding out more about the book, it's on the back of the sheet with the tree ring image. So Jim, I'd like to turn to you and ask you some questions about this movie. Now, one of the things that they said that I think is very relevant to journalism is that it's such a fundamental change in the way the earth is behaving that we need to communicate that as powerfully as possible to everybody. What do you think the role of the journalist can and should be in describing these changes to the public?
Well, I do think that, first off, let me say I am optimistic. I'm an intellectual pessimist, but a glandular optimist when it comes to climate change. I do think we're seeing a building effort to kind of face the problem head on, and it's growing globally. I think that's really part of what we need. And I think it's a journalist's job to kind of unflinchingly, if I can use that word, write about these things. To write about, the last piece I did was on how salmon are disappearing. 30-pound salmon in the Columbia River are disappearing because of dams that have been built there that block their passage, because water is getting warmer in the ocean. It's changing ocean conditions. I think I like to write about those problems and point them out, and I think learning is a big part of the process of trying to come up with a solution. But I also think that we need to I think of myself as an investigative journalist in a way, and I think of myself as investigating what exactly is going on in this world in terms of whether it's birds or salmon. I mean, the story to me in the salmon story was these incredible salmon that are born at 6,500 feet in the mountains of Idaho. They're flushed backwards down the Columbia River to the Pacific Ocean. They live for 4 years out in the Aleutian Islands, and then they find their way back to the river. They swim 800 miles up this river, gain 6,500 feet in elevation, 30-pound fish, and they find the same riffle they were born in, and they go back and they start this process over again. And it's the same with the bird book that I wrote. There's amazing things in the world, and I think part of my investigation is to find out what those are. I mean, incredible things, and to point them out and to write about them, and to wake people up. I think that's a big part of what we need to do. There was a review of my book by Bernd Heinrich, who wrote Mind of the Raven and was a researcher, a bird researcher, a wildlife researcher, and he said about the book, he said, waking us up to things that we take for granted. And to me, that line was high praise, because he knows, he saw what I was trying to do, but he also knows what needs to be done. And so part of the reason I write about the tree ring lab and the salmon and birds is I try to find out the kind of the amazing things about them that we don't know, so that people will think, wow, that's really something I didn't know, that's amazing. And to kind of put a positive spin on this problem that we face, so that people have something to work for rather than to prevent.
Let me ask you a couple of questions about journalism specifically. Christiane Amanpour visited us at the journalism school last week, and on the front of her shirt, or her sweater, she had a message that was, "Be truthful, not neutral." Are there any ethical bounds that journalists are held by that would prevent them from describing what's happening in the world? For example, what do you think about balance, and what should we balance? When is balance appropriate in journalism, and when should we emphasize one side over the other?
Well, that's a tough question, because But by virtue of what you choose to focus on and how you choose to frame a story, you're kind of choosing a bit of a side there. You have to choose what's important and what might be lost, and I think it's an ethical decision, and I try to I try to play it as a referee. At the same time, I'm human, and I also know what's important and to everyone, whether they know it or not. And so I try to focus on things that are coming apart, ecosystems that are being destroyed, and things like that. So I think I try to be as neutral as I can, but at the same time, I think that we have to make decisions every day about what to write about and what to cover.
And so those decisions in and of themselves are making a stand in a sense.
Right. I mean, I wrote the story about salmon, and a lot of emails came to the Times complaining, why are you focusing on these dams? They really aren't the problem. It's ocean conditions, blah, blah, blah. So, but I focused on the dams because I think the science is there, and science is big, is what I do. So I think I go with the science. And but it's always a bit of an opinion to choose what to focus on and how to frame a story and how often you do a story. I mean, a lot of stories these days, you can tell by the number of stories about Donald Trump that journalists think it's a really important story, right? And so it's the same now with climate change. And so just the frequency of stories can really kind of be a way of deciding kind of where you come down on an issue.
Great. And turning back to you, I would like to ask you what you think about what journalists should say about your science and how they should say it, how they should tell it. Is advocacy appropriate?
That's a good question. I mean, I think Jim did a great job when he wrote a piece about the Turing Lab and the exciting research that we do there. And I do think there is an important role for journalism for sure. Also, in kind of in line with what Jim was saying, and climate change is dire. There's very little good news, but it's not the only thing that's going on. There, at the same time, there is a bit of a mistrust towards science and towards education and towards everything that's related to it. And I think there's an important role there for journalists as well, to journalists and scientists alike, to turn that around. I mean, science is exciting. The discoveries we can do. We go to space, we look into individual blood cells, we send robots down people's blood veins, we learn about Genghis Khan through tree rings. Like, how is that not exciting? Why are we not more excited about what we can do? At the same time as all climate change is happening, the reason why we know it's happening is through science. We have never been better prepared for what's ahead of us than we are now. And so communicating that side of things as well, I think is very important in these times.
So why do you think policymakers resist often taking action?
I wish I knew the answer to that. There's no money in science. Not much money in science, or in many lines of science. Whereas there's money in other lines of business. I don't know. I wish I knew why policymakers are not more concerned.
Capital.
Yes, it interferes with things they'd like to do.
And, well, Jim, something tells me that you have an idea or a theory about why people deny that we're dealing with climate change, or theory that you're aware of that is close to your heart in a sense.
Well, it is in a sense, and we talked about this today, but one of the things I think we need to consider. Well, a journalist's job is to ask questions, not necessarily to answer them, and to kind of wonder about things and raise questions. And one of the things, part of, I think, the the problem with climate change has to do with who we are as people and our own fears. I read a paper when I did the bird book. This ornithologist at Cornell, the Cornell lab in New York. The Cornell lab in New York is the premier institution for bird research, and I interviewed a woman there, and she said, and he gave me this paper, and she said, read this, it's interesting. And then people give you a lot of papers, and so one day I kept it in my briefcase for a long time, and one day on a plane ride I got it out and I read it, and I go, holy shit, this is amazing, and this explains a lot to me. And it was a paper this ornithologist had written about why people deny climate change, and it's online, you can find it. It's I think it's called The People Paradox. And she said that, she quoted a guy named Ernest Becker, who wrote a book called The Denial of Death. And in this book, he wrote about how cultures around the world forever essentially have kind of repressed this fear about dying. And she wrote in this paper that when you talk about a global catastrophe, people deny it. They don't like to talk about global catastrophes because it reminds them of their own mortality. And there's, in fact, one of the top researchers in this field is here at the University of Arizona. And they have found that this is empirical. They've been able to replicate this and study this, and I think there's something to this. And so I raised the question that this is something we need to think about at least. I think there's a lot to it, and it's not all out there in terms of the changes we need to make and the things we need to do, the policy changes and management changes and so on. But partly it's who we are and how we encounter the world, I guess I would say.
Mm-hmm. And what is that theory called?
It's called terror management theory. And I think, so when I see things like people talking about mindfulness and meditation and yoga and even death these days, there's a kind of a robust encounter with the idea of this idea. I see things moving in the right direction, I think, to kind of move through that. I have a friend of mine, I wrote a couple books about attention and the role of attention in the human nervous system, and he is a psychologist that I wrote it with. And he's a meditator as well, and he's been doing this for a long time, and he goes to these week-long meditation sessions. And he told me this story about going to one of these sessions and coming out of the session and sitting down at a restaurant, and there were birds flying over the harbor where he was. And he said suddenly and spontaneously he had merged, if you will, with this bird, and he could feel it calling. He could feel the wings flapping. It was this, I guess you could call it a spiritual experience. There's lots of accounts of these kinds of things, but if that's one of the capabilities of the human nervous system from a week's worth of meditation, I'd like to know. I think science should consider these things. I think we should expand our ideas about the world this way and look to other cultures, past cultures, indigenous cultures, and how do they experience the world? What kinds of things do they tell us? One of the chapters in the bird book is about something called ethno-ornithology. And ethno-ornithology is the study of how indigenous people around the world relate to birds. And in those stories about the relationship to birds, we found out a lot about what those cultures are like and what their nervous systems are like and how they use birds in a scientific way, but in a very different way. They talk about a certain kind of bird call will tell them that the weather's changing, or that the soil is dry, or that there's game nearby. And it's a very sophisticated understanding of the ecosystem of the biosphere from birds, and it's very different than ours. I wrote about people in Indonesia, the Basabi, who make up poetry about birds in their native language, and and it's a way of expressing emotion amongst the tribe. I mean, there's a whole range of different things that we could look at to learn something, I think, about our own condition in the world and how we might improve it.
But without trees, maybe we won't have birds.
No birds, no people. Yeah, without trees, it's going to be hard.
Yes, now I know there are quite a few friends out there of the Tree Ring Lab, but there are also probably a lot of people who don't understand how you tell what you are able to tell through tree rings. Now you have to have a reference tree, correct, with rings. Maybe you could explain how that works, because it's fascinating.
Sure. Let me start by saying that we don't cut down trees for our research. We typically take a hollow core. It's kind of like a biopsy from a tree. So I think most people here are familiar with the concept of tree rings. That a tree forms a ring every year, and you can date those rings. You can do more than just counting the rings to get to the age of the tree. The width of the ring actually contains a lot of information. Particularly, what I'm interested in is the climatic information that's reflected in the width of a ring. You can think of it, for instance, here in the Southwest, trees are happy when they have a lot of water. In years when they don't have a lot of water, they're kind of depressed and they're going to grow a very narrow ring. In a wet year, they're going to grow a wide ring. And so if you have a 1,000-year-old tree, you can look at the width of every ring of every year over those 1,000 years and see which of those years was wet and which of those years was dry. And that's the basic premise of our science of tree ring, of climate reconstruction to tree rings. Now, we're not limited to living trees. We can also look at anything that's made of wood that has enough rings in it. So beams in old houses, archaeological wood, even charcoal wood from trees that fell into a lake 10,000 years ago. As long as it's preserved and as long as we can link it to the present, we're good, and we can use that for our science.
How do you link it to the present then?
Through a process called cross-dating. So if you have a tree that you just sampled this year, you know what the latest ring is, right? So you know you can count back. And then, because as I mentioned, the width of the rings in the trees is influenced by the climate under which the trees grow, trees that grow in the same region are going to show the same pattern of narrow and wide rings because they're all influenced by the same climate. And so let's say, for instance, where I did a lot of work in California, 1795 was the driest year ever. And so any sample of wood that you have, that whether I cored it last year and it's 300 years old, or it died 200 years ago, but it has 1795, you can see that same pattern in the rings, and you can, it's pattern matching. It's like making a puzzle. That's why it's so much fun.
And the Tree Ring Lab does give tours for the public, is that correct?
We do give tours to the public on Thursday afternoons. We have an outreach program, so we have docent volunteers who take people for free on tours through the Tree Ring Lab and explain what our science is all about.
Now, as I was watching this movie, I happened to think of the old Greek myth of Pandora and how she was given a box or a jar with all the evils in the world, and she was so curious. She was told not to open it. She did, and the evils escaped, and then she closed the box quickly, trapping inside hope. And eventually hope was released into the world to help assuage some of the evils. And it makes me think of your book about birds. Do you think birds represent hope for the future, or hope when people see them flying free?
I do. I think they're a symbol. I think there are some symbols that are universal and very old, very ancient, and birds are, when we see them, it's a deep feeling of hope, or not hope necessarily, but of transcendence, let's put it that way. I think there's a lot to that. We've kind of lost some of that, but a lot of literature is filled with those kinds of ideas. That show that birds do provide relief from certain kinds of anxiety. They're high in the visual field. I mean, I don't know, people haven't figured out the operable, why people feel this way, but they have measured, same way people are around trees and landscapes and so on, also get relief from anxiety. I mean, there's something to that with birds as well. So yeah, I think literature is just filled with allusions to how birds provide hope, and some people feel they're a way to kind of to teach people, to use them to teach people about climate change, because they provide a kind of relief from the anxiety around this problem. I mean, fear is a big part of what we're dealing with these days. You know, a lot of anxiety, a lot of fearfulness, a lot of worry, rightly so. But somehow we have to get through that to kind of make the right decisions and about what we're doing, and otherwise we're lost. So I think this is an important part of the picture, is to figure out exactly how to do that.
How are we doing time-wise? Okay. So, what do you think we should be teaching our students regarding science? And what classes should students be required to take? What, if you could reformulate the science curriculum, what would you like to see students take so they could understand the climate and the challenges we're facing?
I think climate change is a fact. Not everyone likes to hear that, but it is a scientific fact. If you know what it's about, then you know that there's no way to deny it. There is no. It's based on the physical laws of science, and so in that sense, the radiation budget, how greenhouse gases work, that should be taught, so that students know that there's no debate. It is a scientific fact, so that they can better understand, or there's not better understand, so they can better decide for themselves when they read articles in the newspaper what of them is. They can make an informed opinion about what they're seeing in the news and reading in the news.
Thank you. And what do you think we should teach journalists regarding advocacy versus journalism, traditional journalism, and how engaged they can or should be in issues like climate change?
What should we teach them?
Yes, what should we teach journalism students?
I think the most important thing I tell journalism students is to keep an open mind. Never come to a story or a problem with preconceived notions. I think that's important. Even on things like climate change, where the science is in, there might be different angles you could consider, or different options. Who would have guessed that every time you turn around these days, there's a story about people planting trees? And no one thought that really was the solution 10 years ago. And now it's kind of a meme. It's everywhere, and everyone's doing it. Pakistan has planted 1 billion trees, and all these places have planted trees. And so you just never know where the next answer is going to come from. I saw something today on Facebook or something with Greta Thunberg, and she was talking about planting trees. I mean, this is everywhere, and it's real, and the science is there. So I think just kind of open your mind to what people have to say. People like Valerie or other people who can tell us more about the world that we live in, so we can understand it better and find answers.
Well, I think, I like to think that journalism and science are not alien cultures. They really share a lot. We both cultures like to search for truth. They feel that that's our duty. We owe a duty to the public to do good science, to do good journalism. And we also, both journalists and scientists, believe that decisions should be made based on evidence, and not fake news.
I had kind of two questions. One is,
Do we have time for a few questions? Okay.
in aggregate, given the lithium battery and the toxicity of it producing it, is there a better or worse solution? Is it better to drive an electric car? And the other question is, given, I always read that cats kill more songbirds than anything else. I don't know if that's really true. And given that, why do people insist on having their cats outside? And why do people love cats so damn much? Other than the squawkish country,
So you had two issues you were interested in. How do you balance the being able to drive an electric car, but a car that has a lithium battery? And we saw the issues raised by lithium. I'm not sure either of us, any of us up here, are really experts in that, but it shows you that there are often unintended consequences to trying to solve one problem. You might create another. And then the issue on songbirds and cats. There are lots of threats to songbirds.
Cats are one of the big ones.
And cats are, in fact, one of the big ones. But, you know, I don't want to get into that debate at this
But
point.
part of that goes to this idea of the Anthropocene, is that we've created this massive infrastructure of buildings and of homes and people. I mean, it's just, our footprint is huge. I think one of the answers to all of our problems is to reduce the footprint. And that's one of the things we'll have to do in order to solve it.
I did want to say one thing about that. In a movie, they talk about how more and more people. There's going to be 10 billion people in the near future, and more of those people are living in urban environments. Ecologically speaking, that actually is a good thing. Ecologically speaking, we want more people in more densely populated places rather than those 10 billion people being spread out over the entire Earth's surface. So in that sense, not everything that's happening in our urban environments is bad per se at all.
That's true. And one comment I'll make about the cats is that cats, as I understand it, actually have a bigger carbon footprint than dogs do. Anyway, I think I saw your hand up first, the lady.
This is a bird question. I just came back from 2 weeks in my home suburb of Milwaukee called Wauwatosa. When I was a little girl, there was a robin on every lawn. There was a robin in every elm before they all died, and there were robins in the maples, and I was there for 2 weeks. I did not see one. Now it is September.
That is happening, unfortunately. I think we're, unfortunately, going to have to bring this to a close.
One more question.
Oh, one more question. Okay. I think you might have been next.
I was just gonna ask, for the Anthropocene, I can't imagine that, like, what did they say in the movie 2009, and then you're saying 2014? Like, they probably were thinking about this since the 50s, right? Like, geologists, I mean, so why, like, when did they start actually thinking about this? I mean, it's been going on since the 1900s. I mean, they probably, and why are we seeing the stuff come out only now, 2009 and 2014?
Right.
And
So one thing about the Anthropocene as a geological epoch or geological epochs in general is that it's not just about the impact that we're having now, but let's say 1 million years from now, no more humans are around. Some aliens have discovered Earth, and will they see in the geology, because it's, geological epoch, will they see in the geology the effect we had on the Earth's surface? How lasting is this effect that we're having? And that is not something that you can determine just like that. So one of the things that just came out fairly recently is there's now what's called plastic agglomerate, I think. So there's actually rock that has plastic, man-made plastic in it that is gonna last. You know, it's rock, it lasts. So since that has been discovered, there's more movement toward actually, you know, calling it what it is and actually.
Oh, so those discoveries just came in the last 5-10 years.
That is recent, yeah. So the changes we've been doing have been going on for a lot, but to determine, for one, you need to be on the top of your game scientifically to be able to determine these things. And two, to determine that the changes we're making are unprecedented or more important than other factors at play and are long lasting, that's, you know, there's a lot of conditions that come into play. So
They must have been speculating that this could occur probably for decades.
I agree. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Anyway, I would like to thank everyone for sticking around and listening to our panel discussion, and thank you to Dr. Trouet, and thank you to Jim Robbins, and look for their books. Birds is your most recent book, The Wonder of Birds, I believe, and your book is
Tree Story.
Tree Story. And if you're interested in getting the little poster or little flyer with the information about Valerie's book, we have some available.
And the flyer is 20% off.
Thank you very much. Let's give them a hand.